With 160 billion in market cap and over 400 billion in assets, it's fair to say AT&T's got a good grip on the telecommunications industry. But contrary to what many might think, AT&T is not the largest telecommunications company in the world, let alone in America. At least if you're only comparing net worth. But what AT&T does have going for them is being the largest provider of mobile and fixed telephone services in the United States. But how they built this empire, that's a story of strategy, control, and just a little bit of luck. Like a game where the stakes are real and the board is anything but fair.
Telephone service is 20 years old. Today, telephones in most of the principal countries, territories, and islands around the world are within quick reach of your telephone. Through this switchboard, located in the New York headquarters of the Bell System's Long Lines Department, and other ports like it in San Francisco and Miami, more than 500,000 overseas calls were completed last year. In the year the service started, 1927, 2,000 calls were handled. Nowadays, that many calls or more may be handled in one day alone. Christmas Day 1946 saw more than 3,000 calls completed.
In 1876, Alexander Graham Bell, the man who would change communications forever, just invented the telephone. Bell wasn't just a brilliant inventor, he was also a savvy businessman. In 1877, he formed the Bell Telephone Company, and fast forward a few years, and it had rapidly grown in size and popularity. By 1880, there were about 48,000 telephones in the United States. Jump ahead 20 years, and that number had exploded to over 1.3 million. But here's where things get interesting. Bell Telephone wasn't content with just being a big fish in a small pond. They wanted to be the only fish in the entire ocean. They started gobbling up smaller telephone companies. By the early 1900s, they controlled about 80% of all telephone lines in the United States. Now, you may be thinking, hey, isn't competition supposed to be a good thing? Well, if you said that in a Bell Telephone Company meeting, you would be fired. They believed that a monopoly was the best way to provide universal telephone service. As Theodore Vail, AT&T's president, put in 1907, one policy, one system, universal service. While they were preaching about universal service, they were also crushing any competition that dared to challenge them. It was like owning an entire side of a monopoly board, leaving nowhere for your family to go, except on your properties. But in real life, AT&T owned 80% of that board. They weren't just playing Monopoly, they were winning it in real life. So how did they maintain this iron grip on the telephone industry? First up, vertical integration. Bell didn't just control the phone lines. They owned Western Electric, which produced most of their equipment, from telephones to switchboards. Bell kept it all in the family. Bell also had a neat little trick called the attachment restriction. Basically, they required almost all equipment attached to the telephone system be provided by the telephone companies themselves. Talk about a captive market. This practice was so anti-competitive that it effectively locked out independent suppliers from the market. Imagine if your internet provider told you that you could only use their brand of computer. That's basically what Bell was doing. But Bell didn't stop there. They also had the power to refuse interconnection with other communication systems. In simpler terms, if you weren't playing by Bell's rules, you weren't playing at all. Now you might be wondering, how on earth did they get away with this? Well, that's where things get really interesting. You see, the government wasn't exactly asleep at the wheel. They noticed what Bell was up to, and they weren't happy about it. In 1913, the US government said, hey, wait a minute, this isn't fair play. Enter the Kingsbury Commitment, a fancy way of saying, okay, we'll play nice, sort of. The Kingsbury Commitment was supposed to curb Bell's monopolistic tendencies, but let's be real, it was about as effective as using a squirt gun to put out a forest fire. That's not gonna do much. Under this agreement put forward by the government, AT&T agreed to sell its stakes in Western Union Telegraph Company, a company that was a major player in telecommunications at the time, but now it's mostly known for its money transfer service when you have to send a couple $100s to Romania to get that ransomware off your computer. Basically. Or if you want to send money to family, either way. Apples, tomatoes, add tomatoes, tomato, same thing. They also agreed to stop acquiring other telephone companies without permission and allow independent telephone companies to connect with its long-distance network. Sounds good on paper, right? But here's the catch. This actually allowed Bell to gain even more control on the industry. How? Well, by allowing interconnection, it reduced the independent's incentive to establish a competitive long-distance system. This was the beginning of the end for telephone competition. The government's solution wasn't to foster competition, but to create what some have called competitive apartheid. The government solution wasn't to foster competition, but to create what some have called competitive apartheid. Carefully carve up markets with a monopolist dominating each one. By the mid-20th century, the Bell system, often affectionately, or not so affectionately, called Ma Bell, had grown into a behemoth. We're talking about a company so big it made today's tech giants look like mom and pop shops. How big, you ask? Well, by the time of its breakup, in the early 1980s, the Bell system had assets of $150 billion. That's equivalent to a whopping $440 billion in 2024. And it employed over 1 million people. Yes, 1 million. That's more than the population of some countries. What blows my mind though is that Walmart today has more than double the number of employees worldwide. That's just a small fact for you though. Besides wasn't the only thing that made Bell stand out. They were also at the forefront of innovation. Bell Labs, their research and development arm, was churning out inventions faster than a squirrel on espresso. Did you know the first transistor was developed by Bell Labs? If you don't know what a transistor is, it's basically a tiny device that takes electrical signals and controls that. It makes your smartphone possible, basically. They also gave us lasers, the Unix operating system, which is still used in macOS computers and Android devices today, and even contributed to the development of radio astronomy, which I didn't even know was a thing until now. Not too shabby for a phone company, huh? But here's where things get interesting again. While Bell was innovating like crazy, they were also, to put this delicately, stifling innovation. You see, Bell had this nasty habit of sitting on inventions that might threaten their monopoly. Take the answering machine, for example. The invention that supplies a recorded answer to a phone call and can record a message from the caller. Bell Labs developed it in 1934, but AT&T kept it under wraps for decades, worried it might reduce demand for their telephone services. Because heaven forbid people might want to leave messages when they're not home. And don't even get me started on their color options. For 7 decades, yes, you heard that right, 7 decades, AT&T only offered phones in black. Clearly, they took advice from Henry Ford, the Batman of the 1900s. But, as the saying goes, all good things must come to an end. And for AT&T, the end began in 1974, when the US Department of Justice filed an antitrust lawsuit against them. The government's main beef? Vertical foreclosure. In simpler terms, they accused Bell of using its control over local telephone networks to shut out competitors in equipment manufacturing and long-distance services. Which was exactly what they were doing. It was like Bell had built a massive wall around the telephone industry, and they were the only ones with the keys to the gate. The case dragged on for years, thanks to the deep pockets AT&T had at the time, and still have. But by 1982, AT&T saw the writing on the wall. They agreed to the consent decree that would change the face of telecommunications forever. On January 1st, 1984, the Bell system, as it had existed for over a century, ceased to exist. AT&T was broken up into 7 regional operating companies, affectionately known as the Baby Bells. And just like that, Ma Bell's monopoly was no more. But here's the million-dollar question. Was this breakup a good thing? Did it foster innovation and competition as intended? Or did it create new problems? So, what happened after the breakup? Well, it's a bit like watching a family drama unfold. AT&T, once the stern parent of the telecommunications world suddenly found itself with 7 unruly children, the Baby Bells. These Baby Bells, officially known as Regional Bell Operating Companies, RBOCs for short, were each responsible for providing local telephone service in different regions of the United States. But here's where things get interesting. The breakup was supposed to foster competition and innovation, and in some ways, it did. The long-distance market saw a surge in competition from companies like Sprint and MCI. However, the local telephone service? Well, that's a different story. Each Baby Bell still had a monopoly in its region. It was like breaking up a big monopoly into 7 smaller monopolies. Not exactly the pinnacle of competition. Going from 1 monopoly to 7. Progress. Absolutely fantastic. But wait, there's more. Remember how we said AT&T kept its long-distance service? Well, they thought they'd hit the jackpot. They figured, hey, we'll just dominate the long-distance market instead. Spoiler alert, it didn't work out that way. AT&T's share of the long-distance market plummeted from about 90% before the breakup to about 45% in the mid-1990s. Oh, how the mighty have fallen. Now you might be thinking, well, at least this breakup must have been good for consumers, right? Well, it's complicated. On one hand, long-distance rates fell due to increased competition, which is good. On the other hand, local service rates began to rise faster than inflation. Not so good. But here's where things get really interesting. While all this drama was unfolding in the telephone industry, a little thing called the internet was starting to take off. Remember, just 1 year before the AT&T breakup, ARPANET, the internet precursor, had adopted TCP/IP as its operating protocol. This would eventually lead to a complete transformation of the communications landscape. And let's not forget about mobile phones. In 1983, Ameritech launched its cellular wireless network. At that time, only 12,000 subscribers signed up. Little did they know that these clunky devices would one day make landlines practically obsolete. Who needs a landline when you've got a computer in your pocket? So what's the legacy of the AT&T breakup? Well, it's a bit like watching a game of corporate musical chairs. Many of the Baby Bells went to become big telecommunications juggernauts that you see today. For example, Southwestern Bell merged with what was left of AT&T to form the modern AT&T. Bell Atlantic became Verizon after merging with GTE. The children became their own parents. But perhaps the most important lesson from the AT&T breakup is how it's shaping our approach to today's tech giants. Companies like Google and Facebook are facing similar scrutiny for their monopolistic practices. Just like AT&T, these companies have grown through acquisitions and vertical integration. And just like AT&T, they're using arguments about national security and innovation to defend their dominance. History doesn't repeat itself, but it often rhymes. The words of Mark Twain. It's very accurate in this case. So what does this mean for the future? Will we see a breakup of big tech similar to AT&T's breakup? Or will we learn from the past and find a different solution? One thing's for sure, the story of AT&T's breakup is far from over. Its echoes can be heard in every congressional hearing about big tech, in every antitrust lawsuit against Google or Facebook or any other big tech giant today. As we navigate the digital age, the lessons from the Bell systems, rise and fall, remain as relevant as ever. So the next time you scroll through your Facebook feed or Google something, remember, you're not just using a service, you're participating in the next chapter of a story that began with a simple invention called the telephone. The more things change, the more they stay the same. Wait a minute. Wasn't AT&T just an American company? Well, yes and no. While AT&T's operations were primarily in the US, its influence reached far and wide. You see, AT&T wasn't just a phone company. It was a model for how to build and run a telecommunications monopoly. And boy, did the other countries take notice. Many countries around the world followed AT&T's example, creating their own national telephone monopolies. For instance, British Telecom in the UK, Deutsche Deutsche. Yeah. Deutsche Telekom in Germany and NTT in Japan all took pages from AT&T's playbook. But again, here's where things get interesting. When the US broke up AT&T, it set off a domino effect. Suddenly, countries around the world started thinking, hey, maybe this monopoly thing isn't such a great idea after all. The winds of change were blowing, and they were blowing collect. In the UK, British Telecom was privatized in 1984, the same year as the AT&T breakup. Germany and Japan followed suit in the 1990s. It was like watching a global game of telecom musical chairs. But let's fast forward to today. We're seeing some eerily familiar patterns emerging in the tech world. Companies like Google, Facebook, and Amazon are facing scrutiny for their monopolistic practices, much like AT&T did back in the day. Take Google for instance. Just like AT&T dominated the phone lines, Google's got a chokehold on search engines. When was the last time you heard someone say, let me Bing that for you? Better question is, who uses Bing? Generally want to know. And Facebook? They've been gobbling up potential competitors faster than you could say social network. Instagram, WhatsApp, if you can't beat them, buy them, right? What's interesting is that these tech giants are not operating in just one country. They're global behemoths with influence that spans continents. And just like AT&T used national security arguments to defend its monopoly, we're seeing similar tactics today. Remember when lizardman Mark Zuckerberg argued that breaking up Facebook would give China an advantage? Because nothing says national security like a social media monopoly, right? I feel much safer when they have all my information in one space, neatly bundled for a hacker to take it. Now, while these tech giants are based in the US, they're facing scrutiny worldwide. The European Union has been particularly active in challenging their practices. The European Union has been very active in general in every sector of anything, especially when it comes from America, because America is very behind compared to Europe's legalization and restrictions and all that good stuff. We take notes from them, basically. In 2018, the ECU, or the European Union, fined Google a whopping 4.34 billion euros for antitrust violations. That's billion with a B. But of course, it's Google. They could walk off 4.34 billion euros or almost $5 billion. It doesn't affect them. They're Google. Come on. And it's not just the EU. Countries from Australia to India are grappling with how to regulate these digital giants. So what can we learn from all this? Well, for starters, history has a funny way of repeating itself. The same monopolistic practices that led to AT&T's breakup are now playing out on a global stage with tech giants. But there's a key difference. While AT&T was primarily a US issue, today's tech monopolies are a global concern. Breaking them up isn't just a matter of US law, it requires international cooperation. It's like trying to solve a Rubik's Cube, but every country has a different color scheme. As we navigate this brave new digital world, the lessons from AT&T's rise and fall remain as relevant as ever. Whether you're scrolling through Instagram in India or using Google Maps in Germany, you're part of a global ecosystem shaped by these tech giants. So the next time you're in your room scrolling through Instagram, searching whatever on Google, remember it's not just you using that service, it's an entire ecosystem around the world that's also using it, going through the same thing as you, aka getting your data stolen. But with today's sponsor, I'm joking, I don't have a sponsor. That would have been a good segue though. The more things change, the more they stay the same. But this time, it's global. Now, aside from AT&T's ridiculous large monopoly and all the scandals they did and things that they pulled to get to where they are today, what can we learn from it? First off is that AT&T was not a natural monopoly like they claim to be. They made a lot of sneaky business deals to get to where they are. But at the time it was legal, they just took advantage of loopholes, which is what every financial guru on TikTok would tell you to do, or try to persuade you that they know how to do. It just doesn't always work. But ultimately, history has a funny way of repeating itself. The same monopolistic practices that led to AT&T's breakup are now playing out on a global stage with tech companies. But there's a key difference. While AT&T was primarily a US issue, today's tech companies are global. which makes it even more concerning and more of a hassle to deal with and regulate. Because it's not just one government entity that could close them down or shut them down. It takes multiple efforts from another country to shut it down in multiple regions, I guess you could say. So as we look to the future, the question isn't just whether we should break up big tech. It's about how we can create a digital ecosystem that fosters innovation, protects consumer rights, and promotes fair competition. That's probably the best way to look at it. So once again, the next time you tap that app on your phone or click a search button, remember, you're not just using a service, you're participating in the next chapter of a story that began with a simple invention called the telephone. The more things change, the more they stay the same, but this time, it's up to us to write the ending. AKA new laws. Do better.